Hola, buenas tardes. Voy a presentar muy brevemente esta segunda parte del seminario que comenzamos esta mañana. Todo aquí tiene una razón de ser, por supuesto, es entender el dónde puede estar la pintura hoy, qué puede ser, por qué la abstracción puede ser el movimiento más determinante para entender el arte en el siglo XX, o por qué todas las pinturas, todas las imágenes son pinturas posibles, que es un título de la segunda parte de Nachleben, robado literalmente de un capítulo de un libro de Delfim Sardo. Delfim Sardo está aquí porque bueno, es un teórico y un comisario, además de director actualmente del Centro Cultural de Belém, que para quien no lo conozca en Lisboa, pues es un centro impresionante, con gran colección y con una magnífica actividad. Para mí es la persona que más disfruto muchas veces leyendo por la capacidad, hablaba con varias personas hoy, de la manera que tiene de sintetizar para contar una historia del arte o distintos momentos de la historia del arte. Y Nachleben, ese título, esa palabra alemana, bueno, un concepto muy utilizado pues, por Walter Benjamin, por Avi Warburg, sobre todo para llevarlo al mundo de la pintura, también es parte bueno, leí esa palabra en un texto de Delfim Sardo, ¿no? Es decir, que para mí es una referencia y es un lujo tenerlo aquí y agradezco mucho que haya venido. En la otra parte, la pintura como arte conceptual, es Michael Craig Martin, que dio una conferencia en el año 1997 que realmente para mí es el texto donde más aprendí a leer ese lado conceptual de la pintura, muchas veces con artistas que podríamos considerar antipintura, ¿no? Como puede ser Warhol, como puede ser Duchamp, pero también para analizarlo todo. Michael, yo vi una exposición cuando comenzaba a trabajar en Sintra, a lo mejor Delfim lo recuerda, mucho antes de que existiera el Museo Berardo y la colección allí. Y escribí para la revista Lápiz, luego escribí para la revista Arte y Parte en una exposición del Iván y bueno, estamos encantados de tenerlo y de poder pensar en proyectos futuros. Y por último, Fiona Rae, aquí está con un cuadro, con una pintura que se titula Sky Shout. Esa pintura para mí es la pintura más determinante dentro de mi trayectoria porque bueno, en el año 2004 realicé una exposición que se llamó Sky Shout, la pintura después de la pintura. Era un cuadro que estaba en la parte principal de esa exposición, que nos valía para ver cómo había artistas que seguían trabajando en lo intrínseco de la pintura y que retroceder 20 años para saber que en España pues prácticamente si te dedicabas a exponer pintura o defender la pintura no eras moderno. Y creo que hoy podamos disfrutar que todo un museo como este pueda estar dedicado a ello, pues yo creo que augura mejores tiempos, por lo menos en el lado museístico, para la pintura. Y por último, que van a estar moderados por Carolina Grau, una comisaria que ya para cerrar el círculo, la vez que más intensamente trabajé con ella fue comisariando la exposición de Ángela de la Cruz, que hoy inaugura y que hoy trataremos de acabar para poder irnos todos a disfrutar de la inauguración a Casal Solleric. Carolina Grau es una comisaria muy vinculada al contexto británico, porque ha vivido mucho tiempo allí, pero también muy importante dentro del contexto español, que además ahora está en la comisión de adquisiciones del Museo Svalbard. A todos ellos muchas gracias, a todos vosotros también. Como digo, ya sois público residente en el Aljub de Svalbard, que lleváis aquí 3 días metidos y nada, continuamos. Muchas gracias, Delfim.
Y bueno, muchas gracias, David. Es siempre muy bueno tener amigos para hablar así de nosotros. David me ha pedido para hablar en inglés y entonces yo voy a hablar en inglés. Lo creo que hay traducción simultánea para los que quieran. Y bueno, so I begin with this sentence from a text by Harold Rosenberg that says, it's a very funny sentence. It says that de Kooning says that Friedrich Kiesler looking at some abstract compositions, began softly humming the Internationale. So it is a pleasure to be here trying to think about painting with you. First of all, I want you to know that I don't talk about painting in general for a long, long time. In the last 10 or 12 years, I wrote about specific painters on their work, like Michael Bieberstein, or Juan Araujo, or Julián Sarmiento, or the relation between Berlinda de Brucker with painting. It's the case. It is a sculpture from Berlinda next to Zurbará in the Ancient Art Museum in Lisbon, but not about painting in general. And this is Juan Araujo, one painting from Juan Araujo. I only realized that I didn't talk about painting in general when David invited me to participate in these talks, which allowed me to think again some of the ideas I tried to talk about in the past and somehow see or test what is still or can be still of some use, at least for me. My starting point was a mere confirmation when we see paintings by young painters in exhibitions very frequently today, or they are canvas hanging with no stretchers, or they recapture some of the topics of the 80s return to expression, or they are embedded with AI-generated images, or they reflect a current return to the influence of Luc Tuymans, Marlène Dumas, or Miriam Kahn, or they recast problems of representation that have been very important between the wars, or they dedicate themselves to a remarkable virtuosity, or they dive into the Basquiat urban African syncretism, or they redo the monochrome, or. But the current moment is somehow of such diversity that is very difficult to try to cast some problems or detect any common grounds, except this feeling of synchronicity. Everything, everywhere, at the same time, with the same uneasiness, awkwardness sometimes, and uncanniness other times that the film with that name has. And nevertheless, the actuality of painting comes to surface of the artistic practices once again. And one of the most basic reasons for that is that the practice of painting allows an enormous degree of freedom from the artists, a capacity of not depending on the big production systems that the moving image demands or sculpture requires. And I would like to add, and I will return to this, current practice of painting regards the importance of work and not just decision-making into the artistic creative process. I don't think that work in the classic Marxist approach only went to surface again in the practice of painting because the presence of ceramics, textiles, and crafts testifies other ways of its reappearance, but painting has this unique position of being at the same time a practice and a theory, or at least it is theoretical. Judging on the quantity of painting that we see, again, in galleries and museums, there seems to be an actuality of painting that is, again, raising questions on the global field of image production. Not that a painting is image or can be considered image per se, taking in consideration that painting is the only kind of image that is a skin. And to be honest, in my opinion, painting is nothing else than skin. The situation is most disturbing, I mean the lack of clarity on any kind of debate, because painting has been the field of most debates and production of critical thinking in art, and it has been the most powerful metaphor for the end of art or for the end of the history of art. As Thierry de Duve, the Belgian philosopher, now living for a long time in the United States, once put it, painting is the battlefield of art, the only, until the discussions on sculpture and the body during the 60s. The death of painting has been permanently announced since the symptom of hope in the upcoming painted panoramas in the end of the 18th century by Sir Joshua Reynolds, Mr. Academia himself, to the successive death announcements by Nikolai Tarabukin and all the avant-garde movements during last century, taking hand in hand the death of painting and the death of aesthetics, which is in itself interesting enough. Yes, I hear the voices saying that it was a long time ago, and that it was substituted by discourses on sculpture, then on three-dimensionality, then on image, on moving image, on political implications, on the several returns, or the several turns, the ethnographical turn, the political turn, the gender turn, the identity turn. But nevertheless, the possibility of building an embodied image on a surface with whatever connection to the real world, either centered on the recovery of socially produced images, or as a possibility of producing never-before-seen images, either stemming from the material of painting itself, or from the possibility of metaphorically representing a direct connection with an utopia of expression, painting always was a battlefield. And now what? What happened to this capacity of surviving after death? What Abi Warburg, the German art historian, called Nachleben. So let's go back a little. After a long wait, Arthur Dento wrote about the end of art. So this is, of course, the Rodchenko. Wrote about the end of art, taking as example an exhibition he had seen in 1964 at the Stable Gallery, Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. The painted surfaces that look like serigraphed plywood boxes, as they were afterwards, that reproduced the cardboard Brillo boxes, were supposed to represent the end of art as we had known it. Painting was used once again, and possibly for the last time, as a cruel instrument of art's death, or its symbolic death. Let it be understood, since the process of maelstrom of the 20th century avant-garde movements, and given the enormous continuity of its likely theoretical construction, painting constituted the focal point based on which the criticism of art as merchandise and representation, the two major emphases of the avant-garde processes, was developed. The topic of death of art via death of painting is a very curious one. After the use of the term art in singular by Joachim Winckelmann in 1764 on the title of his book Geschichte der Kunst der Altertums, History of Ancient Art, art's proposed birth 200 years before its declared demise via Brillo boxes, whereby the term begins to designate not a particular artistic discipline, nor a given proficiency or any specific practice of the liberal or servile arts, but a field endowed with a specificity in creative processes. Its putative disappearance occurs at the hands of painting. At the hands, and it's a very poor wordplay, that it happens at the hands, it's very doubly significant, because although the Brillo boxes are a pictorial exercise, like a painting that in its three-dimensional formulation mimics a model, yet because it is a painting eventually converted into a silkscreen, its fate seems to be that of a consumption society ready-made. The game of misunderstandings is a very complex one, and it's worth mentioning that the binding tie to an aesthetic derived from critical thinking is played out in the fabric of these troubled years, last century 60s. At that time, many artists sought various ways to eradicate the possibility of aesthetic, replaced by some sort of analytical thinking, either by an immersion of art in the everyday, in the immersion in the pain, the exhibition, and the movement of the body, supposedly seen as pure presence, and that's what the moment when this was born. Or the notion of art as a happening, an eruption in the flow of things, or by showing the very same everyday things as art, or its painstakingly created replicas. Or politics and language and semiotics, or structure and flow, or psychoanalysis or anthropology, or sociology, or several of these categories combined in an attempt of creating an unstable and expanded field, art. Neither disappearance nor suppression, but rather field enlargement, process metamorphosis, and attempt at paradoxically realizing the romantic ambition of totality, is probably the closest result of the processes whose names crumble between our fingers, such as dematerialization, and I think art never sought to be more material, or conceptualization. It was never really about concepts, but rather about ideas, notions, and projects, or the emphasis on the romantic dichotomy art-life, as Beuys would so emphatically demonstrate. Within the fields of different practices, sculpture, on the one hand, was gradually dismembered into a broad spectrum of procedures that marked out a definitive break from the tradition of statues. Its definition as a practice thus became increasingly difficult, establishing itself as a wide field of spatial practices, unlikely to be confined, and above all, defining itself in the negative in relation to architecture and landscape, as defined by Rosalind Krauss in a very influential and very well-known text. On the other hand, painting remained connected to its tradition dating back from the Renaissance as image production endowed with an inevitable and ostensive need to represent things, bodies, places, or ideas of bodies, things, and places. Curiously enough, this representational character of painting, probably the staunchest opposition in the fight for abstraction in the second decade of the 20th century, was extended to monochromatism, raising it to a practice with a name, methodologies and practitioners, discourses and procedures, readdressing its representation inevitability. Now, the monochrome itself was seen as both the radical and transcendental moment of pictorial practice, as well as its limits and possible line of final survival. It should be noted that monochromatism had held a derisory status in his first attempts with Rodchenko, we've seen it before, but would come to develop from the second half of the 20th century onwards possibilities of construction of visual poetics, sometimes even sustained by near mythical discourses, alluding to negative theology, the Tao, the romantic aura of nighttime, for example, by Ad Reinhardt that we are seeing, or the Portuguese Fernando Calhau. But also in the possibilities of analytical conversion that rested alternatively on linguistic or philosophical, but rarely ever formal grounds, which is particularly curious because the definition of monochrome in itself, it's formal, isn't it? The story of monochrome is very relevant. Coming from an idea of monochromatic that is born from a painting that is not monochromatic, Malevich Black Square from 1915, that occupies symbolically the figure of the father, the possibility of a painting that cuts the link to representation was produced through its installation. The location of the painting in the room where it was presented between December 1915 and January 1916 in Petrograd was a corner, specifically the most oriental corner in the room where the icons were in Russian houses. The precise installation of the painting changed its ontology. It became an icon, meaning an image that does not want to represent. And it is perhaps the first time that a location in the space of an artwork is chosen to convey a specific meaning production. Of course, this led to a series of discourses on the purely conceptual nature of the painting, but in fact, its materiality, and of the other three paintings that Malevich painted in 1923, 1929, and the beginning of the next decade, reveal a precise sense of the perceptual, haptic, and material nature of the painting. Obviously, in contradiction with the purist refusal of sensuality in painting that Malevich himself defends in his manifesto, From Cubism to Suprematism in Art, to the New Realism in Painting to Absolute Creation, written in 1915, in which he complains about the way painting has succumbed to pornography. It's a quotation. We could map out the concerns painting has faced throughout the second half of the century, troubled by the guilt of its sellable nature, as a prime example of art as merchandise, preyed upon by the spectre of its own death, or turning itself into a permanent process of mourning, guilt, and subsumed into a plunge into the mechanical reproduction of images, flooded by photographic, first, and filmic, later, mediations, dismissive of form by the failure of Pollock's project, transformed into a performative process, drowned in the violence of altered conscience, of lost reason, or, on the contrary, in image archiving or the use of banal images, of advertisements, of images that are reified by the propagation of the consumption universe. Amid this complex web of connections, we begin to understand one of the most interesting misunderstandings of the mid-20th century art, which we could call the Pollock misunderstanding, probably one of the most fascinating moments of artistic transformation among the ruins of pictorial practices. One of the most common assertions regarding modernism is stating that it's binded to the idea of form, namely derived from Anglo-Saxon or American criticism that attached modernism to Greenberg and his theory of the deepening of artistic genre by way of the formal isolation of the work in its own self-engrossment. This not being the moment for an overall critique of this partial understanding of Greenberg, which, as a matter of fact, could have a less decorporalized view of painting, it is necessary to understand that modernism has many more sides than those found in the criticism of form, theorized and applied by Greenberg. In this sense, there are two vital landmarks to the understanding of permanence in the modern. The first lies in a moment between Russian avant-gardes, Mondrian and Leo von Duisberg, in the dichotomy between Malevich, Rodchenko and Tatlin, spearheaded by Lisitsky. The second is situated in the fate of Jackson Pollock's legacy, shared between a Greenbergian interpretation and another, strongly criticized by Greenberg, that arose from the writings of Harold Rosenberg and would find significant following in Alan Kapro and the Japanese group Gutai, for example. In 1962, Clement Greenberg, who had always seen in Pollock the clearest materialization of his vision as modernism as a saga of in-depth critical exploration of artistic processes through the means of a given discipline, and therefore the demonstration that painting would find in the processes afforded by the canvas a certain purity that corresponded to an anteriority in relation to the creative gesture. He wrote an article entitled "How Art Writing Earns Its Bad Name," where he tried to ridicule Harold Rosenberg for adhering to a vision of painting as a non-formal gesturalism. The underlying reason for that attitude rested on a schism regarding the nature of the modern. Rosenberg, who 10 years early, in 1952, had written a watershed article titled "The American Action Painters," argued that the end result of painting was secondary to its process and gesture. The specificity that Rosenberg found in the New York painting scene of 1950s was rooted in action, in the gesture that unveils an absolute subsumption of art in life, as he himself states. In other words, his approach to the modern resides in understanding it as an exit process from the formal nature of painting through another formality, that of the gesture, of the choreography, of psychological reason, whilst Greenberg could not, given his Kantian precepts, set himself apart from criticism as a kind of judgment production activity, and therefore depending on the recognition of the transcendental imagination zoned activity, the detection of form or its construction by the subject. What is interesting to remark is that Rosenberg's attitude, influenced by the images of Hans Namuth, is derived from an existentialist thinking, Sartrean, according to Greenberg, implying a purist and moral reasoning of artistic practice, which nowadays could look tainted with moralistic and conservative fumes, and one can read the critical text by Hubert Damisch on the moralistic Sartrean approach to art, written in 1959 and so well commented by Yves Lambois, but I'll return to this afterwards. However, the burden of conservatism and formalism ended up resting on Greenberg, although the question of form is rooted in a much more collective approach, one upon which social principles are found, as Kant and Schiller demonstrated. The debate on taste is seminal to the creation of common sense, and as such, the possibility of conviviality, considering that ultimately aesthetics lay the groundwork for the sense of community and the very act of sharing that forges the idea of community and, by extension, of public space. Jacques Rancière has wonderful pages about this link between subjectivity and the political and social in a book called Aesthesis. Curiously enough, Namuth's photos would make Pollock into a champion of the connection between art and life, and this very assumption led Alan Caprow in 1956 to understand Pollock's work as a path in the direction of the performative nature of the moment, or the instant, that would institute the art of happening, of the ephemeral and the theatrical, although Pollock made oil paintings that had in themselves nothing ephemeral about them. This way, Caprow looks at Pollock for a path to a performative art, not because the objectiveness of his painting is in any way performative, which is true even from the point of view of reception aesthetics, but because Pollock's introspective and radical gesturality seems directed towards an idea of happening that possesses, and here with formalist shock and awe, theatrical quality. In the total absence of contamination between disciplines, where Greenberg has found the heart of modernism, Caprow has found theater, which is, for him, the main core of the modernism's fate through the body's presence. What is the most interesting is the way Caprow claims Pollock's legacy as painting's final curtain probably stems, as stated by Barbara Rose, in Namuth's images shown at MoMA in 1951, like this, including the film Pollock 51, then Pollock paintings themselves. Let us also bear in mind that after the drips that lasted only for 3.5 years, Pollock continued to paint, even holding a retrospective exhibition in 1953, at which time his return to figuration and distancing from the lavender mist phase were plain to see. Curious enough, and as a final pun on the misunderstanding novel, I remember seeing, some years ago, at a very programmatic exhibition on developments of painting at Tate Modern, a Pollock drip exhibited on the floor with Namuth's Pollock 51 film presented on the wall above it on a screen. The caricature was completed with a 10-centimeter plinth on top of which the painting was lying as a sad graveyard for painting itself. Here rests the remains of painting, a collateral damage of action portrayed in a 16-millimeter film. Rest in peace. And so, the redemption of painting, its auspicious future and fate, in the opinion of Clement Greenberg, between 47 and 50, coincides with the end of painting, its conversion into gesture, its plunge into life, where the uselessness of representation is presumed, seen as life. And life means just to be lived. In the following decade, and starting from a formal understanding of Pollock and abstract expressionism, resilient painting devoted itself, on one hand, to photographic image or the mediation of its images through photography, and on the other hand, to a return to monochrome. It is needless to evoke the example of Gerhard Richter near encyclopedic archiving of pictorial procedures, produced from the reinvention of virtuosity, or the multi-layered character of Robert Rauschenberg's work, for example. They constitute some of the very significant examples of reinvention of painting as image, or we could also talk about the work of John Baldessari, who navigated who navigated from a fractal point with pictorial practice towards a reacquaintance via photography through the memory of Matisse. Painting went through pop, converted into image, and through the minimal, reconverted into wall, color surface, or applied to objects. Of course, all these amazing pictorial and artistic practices have a feel of mourning, a sense of guilt for continuing an unavoidable in painting, which is its inevitable reference to a history and a tradition of image construction that, as any other art form, permanently brings forward problems of the past. And it always was the case. We can just evoke the lineage that stems from Manet, Olympia to Tiziano, and from Tiziano to Giorgione, or from Manet des Cieux l'Herbe back to Raphael, seen by Manet in a print from Marcantonio Raimondi after Raphael's Judgment of Paris. That was copied in itself from a relief of an ancient sarcophagus that is now on the walls of Villa Medici in Rome, according to the study of Aby Warburg. Painting has this capacity of going back to itself, like an ongoing practice of reappropriation of images in a conceptual construction of a different context, rereading and reenacting itself on and on. To answer to the title of this series of talks, yes, painting is, because it always has been, a revolving conceptual practice on its own via surface affections. È cosa mentale. At the heart of this scenario of a guilty practice, we begin to perceive the permanent need of articulating a discourse on painting that does not fall into the trap of its formal and internal, compositional, chromatic, etc., theoretical grounding. Rather, this discourse should be found in some other place, in some other exterior existence, the benefit of the decontextualization accorded to pictorial images by the museum processes as they are referred by Jacques Rancière. The museum is a process of removing issues of meaning and substituting them for different ones, of erasing some of the contexts and substituting them for other contexts, and redoing the process of meaning, wrapping them in educational, experiential, or art history reinvention. It would be an interesting analysis to analyze the recurrence at a given moment of the same words or terms applied to completely different pictorial projects in a kind of meat grinder that normalizes everything. And we work in museums, and museums can be very responsible to this meat grinding interpretation and reinterpretation of the works with a small lexicon. This is a process that we could call of contextual reification. It seems necessary to find a reason outside the issues of protocol that are intrinsic to the artistic practice, to then be able, in a seemingly politically valid way, to support a work's process decision. The interest around Gerhard Richter lies in the fact that he carries out a criticism of the possibility of painting or the ideological character of images. Glenn Ligon's interest lies in the fact that he's an example of American art in its full-blown multicultural character. Neo Rauch's interest lies in the fact that he speaks of the German difficulty in dealing with history, etc., etc. And in this process, a reenactive process like painting that finds in its own materiality the ground for its theoretical approach is frequently commented as image, as a form of imagectic communication, which is completely diminishing of its complexity. Marlène Dumas or Miriam Kahn don't produce images of faces and bodies. They question, in a non-proposition theoretical way, the possibility of reinventing a drama, a poetics, a pathos of the body revealed through the means of painting. In other words, Painting is inevitably situated within the axis of tradition that can be traced back to the dawn of Renaissance modernity, which encompasses a series of issues that deserve to be indexed and whose persistency allows for questions to be raised on the perennial of the pictorial problems or in the context of art in a broader sense. We can try to bring a series of topics that fall back into contemporary painting practice, a map with which to understand some of the guidelines of painting perennial character as a procedure for the generation of epidermic images. In a great text entitled Painting as Model, that I already mentioned before, Yves Alambois, on his comments on Hubert Damisch, proposes an understanding of painting through 4 models. First, the perceptive model that states that painting is directed to a specific aesthetic perception based on a quality of attention to the detail, to the modulation, to the fine-tuning of the distance of the viewer. Do we see it from afar, or should we see it really close? Are we carried by the brush movement or the gestalt? We can read the wonderful pages of Daniel Arras, the French late art historian, on the detail to understand that an aesthetic and perceptive model is also a process of knowledge. And the aesthetic process is simultaneously a gnoseological knowledge process, or quoting Nietzsche applied to painting, depth is a wrinkle in the surface. Second, the technical model that refers to the link between process and result, something very similar to the Russian concept of factura. It is a model of understanding painting that refers to the invisibility of the process, to what the eyes don't see, but are essential to what the eyes see. It is what Aristotle called the formal cause. Third, the symbolic model, to which I would call the iconological model following Aby Warburg. How does the paintings from Duchamp resonate with Einstein and the popular idea of fourth dimension? How does Mondrian resonate the history of the property division on Dutch landscape painting of the 17th century? How does Malevich resonate with Jacobson structural linguistics? How does Caillebotte, matter of fact is this one, Caillebotte. How does Caillebotte resonate with the proletarian dignification in 1870s Paris working class culture? In other terms, what can we learn from painting, not through painting? And finally, the strategic model, meaning the game of internal fights, alternances, advances and pullbacks that painting always brings to the front of artistic practice. Luc Tuymans versus Richter, Juan Araújo versus Blinky Palermo, discovering that the palette used by Palermo stem out of the pinball machines that he liked to play. And so Palermo's paintings are not abstract, but strictly figurative of the design of the pinball machines. They are just blown up. Picasso versus Manet, versus Velázquez, Glenn Ligon versus Kossuth, John Baldessari always asking, Picasso or Matisse? It's a question that he used to ask, Picasso or Matisse? For someone to whom the right answer would be, obviously, Matisse. And all in an endless and ahistorical return to the same through different perceptive, technical, and symbolic models. In this web of topics that have haunted the practice of painting, we outline the problem of its survival and the historical relation it defines as different lineage of pictorial practices are established, which nowadays plainly coexist, and maybe for that very reason, they define a sort of enlarged field of painting. That is why I get suspicious when I see an enormous amount of paintings that are now shown that seem only to correspond to a certain market trend. Why so many paintings are now presented with no stretchers? Does it correspond to a return of the support surface movement? it is easier to transport to art fairs? Should we be trying to look better at what painting critical meaning or purpose? However, at the same time, painting continues to produce images that are not just pictorial, but are rather images about the possibility of the practice of painting. That is, nowadays, there is no painting to speak of what does not address its own transcendentals, meaning their possibilities, beyond all the issues of meaning or other cultural, ethical, political, or idiosyncratic issues ascribed to it. It is impossible for any aesthetical thinking on painting to disregard that the representation of this knot of contingencies, announced deaths, suicides, passionate dramas, and recurrent returns is where painting is carried out, permanently connected to a body that makes and to a skin that produces image. Or rather, it moves through the interstices of its manipulation by the recurrent way whereby it activates an historical legacy permanently, subject to revision, irony, appropriation, expansion, massacre, and paradoxically alive in its necrological condition. Painting, this strange recurrent body, continues to afford a clear political possibility, that of allowing for the construction of universes and specialities, of questioning hierarchies of the visible through technologies of image that are irrepressibly corporeal, that can only exist in the performative dimension of a body, which, standing before an epidermis, discovers the synthetic shiver of surface and the other, the organic one, of its own skin. What that body will whisper inside itself will remain entirely of its own responsibility. That's why painting, I think, it's still a good problem. Thank you.
Más que una pregunta, una curiosidad. Trabajamos en el contexto ibérico, eres conocedor de lo que ha pasado en el contexto español, se ha debatido un poco por la mañana. ¿Cómo se ve desde Portugal, o sea, un país como el nuestro en España, con una tradición pictórica tan grande, si vamos para atrás, cómo se ve en relación a esa tradición la pintura contemporánea? Por ejemplo, ¿cómo crees que se puede situar a nivel internacional? Porque, bueno, creo que Portugal ha tenido pintores que han conseguido, bueno, pues también salir muy lejos, como pues Sarmento, como puede ser Cabrita en su lado pictórico. Es decir, ¿cómo se ve desde Portugal a día de hoy el contexto y el mundo de la pintura?
Pero Portugal y España parten de lugares muy distintos en términos de su historia y tradición pictórica, porque Portugal no tiene una tradición de pintura como tiene España. España tiene una tradición fundamental de la historia de la pintura europea, y eso no pasa con Portugal. Lo creo que eso, la importancia histórica de la pintura en España funciona un poco, tiene dos lados, ¿no? Tiene un lado que es dar un contexto muy intenso, muy fuerte y con una capacidad de diálogo con la tradición enorme. Y eso pasa de la pintura del arte en general. Yo me acuerdo siempre, Juan Muñoz y su permanente diálogo con Velázquez. Por otro lado, hay un peso histórico que es muy pesado, ¿no? Es muy difícil con una tradición como la pintura en España que los artistas más jóvenes encuentren un camino que es un camino con sentido y con una oportunidad que de alguna manera pueda dialogar con la fuerza y la intensidad de la historia de la pintura española. Lo creo que lo pasa exactamente lo mismo en Francia. La realidad en Francia es seguro que es la misma. Y yo creo que eso, claro que la pintura tiene esta capacidad de se reinventar permanentemente, siempre. Y tener siempre la posibilidad de, en la recurrencia de las temáticas, encontrar sus nuevas temáticas. Y lo creo que hay, claro, hay tal vez mucho más pintores en España, digamos de la generación que tendrán ahora como 30 y tal, 40 años, que en Portugal. En Portugal la práctica de la pintura es más pequeña, más circunscrita. Por otro lado, lo veo que la pintura en Portugal, esos jóvenes pintores tienen una capacidad de autonomía en sus propuestas porque no viven con el peso de la intensidad de la historia pictórica que no la tienen. Mismo Portugal, hay una otra diferencia que es muy importante, es que Portugal no ha tenido a lo largo de los años ningún museo con colecciones portuguesas en exposición permanente o semipermanente. La única ejemplo sería Gulbenkian. Tenemos más como centros culturales con exposiciones temporales que la posibilidad de ver una otra vez. Y yo hablé aquí de Fernando Callau, que es un pintor portugués muy importante de los años 70, 80. Fernando Callau, no hay ningún lugar en Portugal a donde se pueda ver más que una o dos pinturas de Callau. Y es totalmente desconocido de las generaciones más jóvenes, porque la última exposición que Callau ha hecho ha sido en 1992. Perdón, 2002, hace 23 años. Los artistas que tienen 30 y tal años no han visto esa exposición. Entonces, lo creo que esta ambivalencia de la historia es siempre compleja, ¿no? Tiene siempre dos lados.
Muchas gracias, Delfim.
Stepping up.